All right. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Working People, a podcast about the lives, jobs, dreams, and struggles of the working class today. Brought to you in partnership with In These Times magazine and the Real News Network, produced by Jules Taylor, and supported entirely by listeners like you. Working People is a proud member of the Labor Radio Podcast Network, so if you are hungry for more worker and labor-focused podcasts and radio shows like ours, then follow the link in the show notes and go check out all the great shows in our network. And, if you want to support the work that we are doing here at Working People so we can keep growing and keep bringing you more important conversations, and we always need your support, then please leave us a positive review on Apple Podcasts. Share this episode on your social media and with your coworkers, friends, and family members. And of course, the best thing that you can do to support the show is become a paid monthly subscriber on Patreon for just a measly $5 a month. Now, it's not much, but every little bit helps. And it's really because of the money that we get on Patreon, which is not very much, that we are able to keep doing this show. If we don't have that money, we can't do the show. So if you want to become a subscriber, just go to patreon.com/workingpeople. That's patreon.com/workingpeople. Hit the subscribe button and you will immediately get access to all of our awesome bonus episodes that we've recorded and published over the years for our amazing subscribers. We are also using the Patreon to expand our repertoire to, include some fun video productions. And, if you go to Patreon right now, you can watch the full video version of our first listener hang session, which we recorded earlier this month, and it was lots of fun. And shout out to Jules for editing that video and putting it together. I had a lot of fun rewatching it, so if you want to check that out, go subscribe on Patreon, and we've got more bonus episodes coming your way. My name is Maximilian Alvarez, and we've got another important conversation for y'all today. So, we all know that the school year is starting up again. For many around the country, it's already started. For most students, teachers, and staff, this may be their first time going back to in-person schooling in over a year. And many school districts are indeed pushing through with in-person schooling. Even though, we are in the midst of another COVID-19 spike, with new cases around the country rising to their highest point since the worst point in the pandemic, which was around January of this year. And, just to give you a sense of the landscape and where things are right now, here's what Dan Levin writes in the opening paragraphs of a piece in the New York Times that was published this Sunday. So Levin writes, quote, "The daily average for hospitalized COVID-19 patients in the United States is now more than 100,000 over the last week. That average is higher than in any previous surge except last winter's, before most Americans were eligible to get vaccinated. The influx of patients is straining hospitals and pushing healthcare workers to the brink, as deaths have risen to an average of more than 1,000 a day for the first time since March. The 7-day average of COVID hospitalizations peaked in mid-January with nearly 140,000 people hospitalized. Hospitalizations nationwide have increased by nearly 500% in the past 2 months, particularly across southern states, where ICU beds are filling up, a crisis fueled by some of the country's lowest vaccination rates and widespread political opposition to public health measures like mask requirements," end quote. So, one of those southern states that has been hit hard by this new COVID wave is South Carolina. And, according to South Carolina's Department of Health and Environmental Control, today the state logged 4,343 new cases of COVID-19 and 37 new deaths, with large swaths of the population still unvaccinated, including 50 million children nationwide under the age of 12. And, with vaccine and mask mandates having been sucked into the hopeless vacuum of culture war hysteria, and with the more contagious Delta variant spreading like wildfire, schools in South Carolina appear to be on the all too familiar collision course with COVID spikes that will lead to panicked returns to remote learning, but only after a large amount of students, teachers, staff, and parents get infected. Now, I want to be very clear. I'm not saying all of this, because I'm some doom and gloom prophet who wants the sky to fall. I've been living through this crap for nearly 2 years, just like all of you. I am desperate for this shit to be over. I want it to be over. I am exhausted by all this pain, frustration, and death. I'm just saying we've seen where this is all headed because we've been through it multiple times during this last hellish year and a half. We have seen how people attack teachers and staff for wanting to prevent needless infections and deaths as if it's somehow their fault that the pandemic is happening. And we've seen people in power, people in the media, and even people in our own neighborhoods ignore their warnings and disregard their needs. And here we are yet again. To talk about all of this and, to break down what the situation looks like on the ground for educators who are on the front lines, I had the honor of sitting down with Casey Scully, who teaches in Charleston. I had such a great time chatting with Casey. And, even with all this madness going on, we still ended up having a wonderful conversation about her life and the path that led her to being an educator. Casey is a former elementary school teacher, and now she's a high school math interventionist. And don't worry, I asked her what that means, and it's very cool, so I'll let her tell you. But, like so many others this month, Casey has gone back into the classroom where, on top of all of her teaching duties and her clearly fierce commitment to her students and her coworkers, she also has to worry about the virus, about getting a breakthrough infection and passing it on to others. She has to worry about the students who suddenly don't show up one day. She has to worry about a district and about decision makers who have shown how willing they are to put workers, students, parents, and communities in harm's way. And, while I am eternally grateful that there are so many amazing and dedicated teachers like Casey out there, my heart continues to break for them and for all of us. Listen, I know remote learning is hard on everyone. I know there are no really good options here. But I also know that we would be in a much better position today if, instead of ignoring or vilifying them, we actually cared about and listened to workers like Casey. This is her story.
Well, hi, y'all. My name is Casey Scully. I am a high school math interventionist. I was previously an elementary school teacher. I live in Charleston, South Carolina. fun facts include I can lick my elbow. I have 2 cats, and I love houseplants.
Nice. All right. So everyone listening knows that I'm a huge cat person. So tell me, I got to ask, tell me about your 2 cats.
So my oldest cat, Sushi, I got off Craigslist. He was a Craigslist cat that his previous owner was in the military and was going overseas and needed to rehome this cat that he'd had for 7 years. And so I thought that was such a sad story. And I went to meet him, and Sushi hated my guts. He did not want anything to do with me. And I said, perfect. So I brought him home, and it took about probably 6 months for him to warm up to me, but he is truly the best. And then I have a younger cat. Her name is Sunny, and she is a true blue street cat. I was walking my dog, and we heard little kitten meowing, and he dragged me towards this alley in downtown Charleston, and tucked in between the sidewalk and a dumpster was actually this teeny tiny little kitten who I scooped up and put in my sweatshirt, brought her back to my microscopic downtown apartment with every intention of vetting her and finding her a beautiful home. But they quickly became best friends, and I realized it would just be easier for me to move and start a new life than it would be for me to try and find her a new home. So we have Sunny and Sushi now, and they run the house.
Listen, kid.
Okay, hold on. I'm doing some like quick on the fly podcasting magic. 1 second. Do you remember this movie, The Oliver and Company?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so let's see. So I'm back. Okay, so Jules is my producer, so I'm giving him little notes. So Jules, I'm gonna hop in and try to play this a clip from this song real quick. All right. Sorry everyone. This is Max. Quick little interjection here. So I kind of got ahead of myself when I was recording this part with Casey. Just hearing her kind of talk about her cats suddenly made me remember that the old Disney movie from the 80s, Oliver and Company, where the lead character, the main dog, named Dodger, is played by the voice of Billy Joel. And I hadn't thought about this song in well over a decade. But suddenly when Casey was describing her cats, I could hear like Billy Joel singing that one song, the song. And so I played it on my phone, and we were jamming out to it. But I realized very quickly after the recording that I was like, oh shit, that's definitely going to be a copyright violation. So we're not going to play the song. But in case you're not unfamiliar with which song I'm talking about, it's the one that goes, why should I worry? Why should I care? I may not have a dime, but I got street savoir-faire. I can sing better than that, but again, I'm just trying to not get us screwed over by copyright stuff. Also, that song is a total jam. Okay, anyway, back to the conversation. All right, sorry, I was just over here just vibing to that song.
Same.
Literally haven't thought of that song in 20 years, but the first thing I heard about when you were describing Sushi and Sunny. So does that give an accurate portrayal of your 2 little babies?
Oh, absolutely. Without a doubt, that is the energy all the way.
Outstanding. Well, honorary friends of the pod, Sunny and Sushi. So that's great. I'm glad that that you have them. I know that especially given the madness that we've been living through for the past year and a half, almost 2 years now with COVID-19, pets have been a real lifesaver for many of us. So you mentioned something earlier in your kind of introduction that I guess I just wanted to kind of clear up for listeners who maybe have been out of the game for a while. But you said that You used to be, you said a middle school teacher, right?
I was an elementary school teacher.
Elementary school teacher. Okay. Mm-hmm. Apologies for that. And then now you are a math interventionist. So what does that mean?
Yeah, sure. So basically, I work with 2 high schools in Charleston County, and I support 9th graders predominantly, but some 10th graders in their foundational math skills. So specifically, Algebra 1 is one of the most failed courses in high school. Something like 65% of students either barely pass Algebra 1 or fail Algebra 1 the first time that they take it. And so what we found as educators was that students who were lacking foundational math skills, so, we're struggling with multiplication and division, who are having a hard time with the conceptual understanding of math, were having a really hard time when they got to Algebra 1. And so I thought that was really important. And coming from an elementary school background, I love foundational math skills. I love teaching foundational math skills. And so now I split my day between 2 schools where I support students there who are at risk of failing Algebra 1 and who really need help with those foundational skills.
Man, that's awesome. And thank God there are folks like you out there, because I sure as hell remember when I was struggling with math. I was fortunate enough to have a brother who actually knew math, so I would always bug him. But if I didn't have him, I don't know what the hell I would have done. And against his best efforts, he still couldn't get me to understand calculus. So sorry, Zach. Thanks for trying. So were you always kind of a math-minded person? Were you good at math when you were a student?
Oh, absolutely not. Which I think is why I like my job so much, because math was so hard for me. I mean, even just hearing you say calculus, I never even tried calculus. I stopped at CP, Prob, and Stat. Math does not come easy to me at all. And so it was not until I was teaching that I really had to dig in and understand the conceptual ideas behind math so that I could better teach my students. And then once that light bulb kind of clicked on for me, I said, oh my gosh, if it took me 20 years to be able to figure this out, I can't imagine being, 13, 14 years old and trying to figure it out, and how that must feel for those students. And so my goal is to work with students specifically who it doesn't come naturally to them. It doesn't come easy to them, because I think my experience gives me the opportunity to see it from their perspective. And, I think about the way that I learn, and I try to present it to the student in a bunch of different ways to hopefully help them.
That's so awesome. And I mean, it's such an important facet of being a teacher, right? I mean, I think it's one of the things that makes a really effective educator. And, I have never taught K through 12. So that is at 100% kind of a ball of wax that I cannot comment on. But, I'm thinking even when I was able to teach college students for a time, I always said when I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan, I was like, I think graduate students make the best college instructors. And, obviously all the tenured professors and venerable, intellectuals would bristle when I would say such things. But I was like, it's exactly because of that, right? It's like, because as a graduate student, you were in the kind of hierarchy of instructors at a university, from, graduate students to adjuncts and lecturers to associate professors to full professors, yada, yada, yada. You were the one who was still closest to the time when you did not know the shit that you know now, right? And you can you're most able to remember vividly what it was like to not know those things and what it took for that stuff to eventually click for you, right? And so you can kind of speak to that you can speak to both sides, right? You could speak from the side of like, now kind of having this knowledge that you're trying to convey or having these skills that you're trying to teach, but you can direct them to, students in a way that is like, attentive to the gaps in their knowledge and where they're coming from, right? It's not just an age thing, right? It's not just that you remember what it was like to be 18, 19, 20, but obviously the older you get, the more you forget about that. But there is something really important, right, about that speaks to kind of like why teaching isn't just about kind of taking what's in a textbook and like forcibly downloading it into students' brains, right? You have to, it's a really, back and forth sort of dance where you're trying to kind of get them to take those sorts of steps to internalize the kind of stuff that you're talking about. And so anyway, this is a really long roundabout way of saying like kind of still being able to recall, right, like your own struggles with math and what it took for those things to actually click. I don't know, like it just seems that when I can think of the teachers who had the biggest impact on me, even in K through 12, it was ones who were able to speak to me where I was at and understand where those gaps in my knowledge were and what it would take for me to kind of surmount them. Does that make sense?
Yes. I think what I tell people all the time is that it boils down to trust. And, if there is not a level of trust, a deep level of trust, then learning doesn't happen. And that is, not just specifically in a K-12 classroom. I mean, that goes in any relationship, right? It's like when we're lacking that trust, when we don't genuinely believe that the people that we're interacting with, like love us, care about us, and have our best interest at heart, then we're not interested in what they have to say. And so I think that for me is the biggest thing. It's just being able to share my lived experience with my students and, teaching in a school that was very similar to the high school that I went to with students who have lived very similar lives that I have, and that level of trust and that bonding that we create, because I genuinely do see them and hear them and understand what their life looks like outside of school, then and only then are they able to really dig in to the academics of it all. Because that's second. I mean, that's really what comes second. First, you have to engage them as people and engage them as, changing, growing, learning individuals. And then once you show them that you love them, you care about them, you see them, then we can start learning some academics.
Hell yeah. I love that. I mean, your students are lucky to have you because I know, we love and appreciate educators of all sorts on this show. We've spoken to many on the show, and we honor the important work that y'all do. But obviously, there are a lot of teachers, there are a lot of schools. Not everyone gets that kind of experience with the teachers that are available to them. There are a lot of different factors playing into that, underfunding of schools and yada, 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 right? Point is just that, not everyone, gets to have teachers who treat them with that kind of respect for who they are as individuals and growing human beings. So it's just a really great and beautiful thing to kind of hear you talk about that. And it made me realize that, I'm already so comfortable talking to you and talking about your cats that like I kind of blew past like, one of the, standard sort of working people kind of questions about, where you come from and kind of how you came to be the person that you are. And I guess since we're kind of talking about school, right, and the kinds of students you work with, the kind of student that you were, I meant to ask, are you originally from South Carolina? Like where did you grow up?
So I am originally from North Carolina. I grew up on a tobacco farm in a little tiny town called Wise, North Carolina. I moved to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. So complete polar opposite when I was 14. So just imagine being the world's most awkward, sheltered 14-year-old, grows up on a farm from a very Baptist conservative family. And then imagine the week before the 10th grade, you move to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and your first, foray out into the world is going down to the boulevard to see Bike Week. Like, that was my childhood. So
what the heck was it like growing up on a tobacco farm?
I mean, it was like living in a bubble. Truly, honestly, it was. Like I said, my family was very conservative, very religious. My entire town, the entire town of Wise, North Carolina, has one stoplight. My great uncle is the mayor and the fire chief. And like, they decided that election by putting coins in a can, and whoever raised like the most money in their can got to be the mayor. And like, so that was kind of my early childhood and my memories. But I mean, it was just like living in a bubble. There was no concept of the world outside of Wise, which led me to a very rude awakening when I discovered everything that was available to me outside of that.
You mean your coffee can democracy doesn't exist everywhere else?
Oh gosh, it was so interesting because there were so many things about growing up that way that were not even intentionally, but like unintentionally so damaging. And there was so much unlearning that had to be done. So after moving to Myrtle, I was living with just my mother and then my brother, and we were on all sorts of government assistance. I mean, we moved every 6 months because mom couldn't afford to pay rent for any longer than that. And we were struggling a lot. And, I think school kind of saw the most of that. So I was on a first name basis with my high school principal. I spent more time out of class than in class. I was very familiar with all of the emergency exits that you could leave quickly. So, I guess going from very sheltered, very conservative farm life to the dirty Myrtle, South Carolina, it was a big culture shift for me. And that culture shift led me to really do lots of experimenting, to like, I had 15, 16 years to make up for. And so I definitely took advantage of that.
So how did your family handle that? Cause I know, that my folks, so I've talked about this a lot on the show, but I was raised very Catholic, very conservative growing up. But I was over in Southern California. Right. But yeah, I mean, we had a pretty strict upbringing. And we got grounded a lot. And, I remember my folks, grounded me for like 4 or 5 months, when they found out I lost my virginity. Like, I had to, basically live an ascetic monk life, with a bed, a desk, and that was it. And then they even grounded my brother Zach because they blamed him for having a bad influence on me. So it's like I can remember it. We all laugh about it now, but like, I remember kind of that weird back and forth kind of process of self-discovery when you are kind of challenging the rules that you were brought up to abide by, right? The kind of guilt that you were raised to have about, I don't know, sin, about, skipping school, about getting bad grades, about all that stuff. Again, I guess if we're just staying in that mode of trying to kind of remember what it was like to be in the very position of the students that you are now teaching, right? It's a really tough time in your life. I know it's a cliche to say like, oh, high school is tough, but like it is, right? There's so much self-discovery going on there, so much kind of boundary pushing, and still so little autonomy that you get to have in that process that it can be very messy. So anyway, I was just curious to know a little more about how you and and your mom and your brother kind of handled this this rebellious transition to Myrtle Beach.
Well, I guess the best way to describe it is my parents found out I lost my virginity by reading my diary and then snapped my flip phone in half and took the door took the door off of my bedroom, so I did not have a bedroom door, snapped my flip phone in half, and yet still I was sneaking out. But this is a fun story. I was sneaking out probably 4 nights a week. And realistically, I wasn't really doing anything that awful. I did not drink. I did not do drugs. There is a long history of addiction in my family. So that was not something that I was interested in even trying as a teenager. So I was just, going outside to, hang out with my friends late at night and be bad, in air quotes. And so, but my mom, I have this very vivid memory of her coming into my room one night and sitting down, and she said, well, I just wanted to let you know that there have been sightings of this van that's been driving around our neighborhood late at night. So, just tell your friends to be careful. So she definitely knew that I was doing all of these things. And I feel like I got really lucky because for the most part, she knew that I was going through this process of self-discovery and I was boundary pushing. And she just wanted to make sure that I was safe at the end of it, but didn't really fight me past, the door and the phone and things like that.
Man, I was kind of laughing while I had the microphone muted because it made me think about, so I'm about to put him on blast, but I got one of my best friends in the world, Biggs, he lives back home in Southern California. So he was the first one who got his driver's license out of all of us, right? So that made him the king for, I don't know, 8 months. But the problem was that he had this big giant boat of a van that was one of those 80s vans that I don't know, you could spot it a mile away, right? And so if he was trying to sneak around, anyone who saw that dumb van knew it was him. So and yet that didn't stop him, right? So he would sneak out all the time, and you'd see his big dumb van kind of scooting around town at 1 or 2 in the morning. And then I remember one time, I feel like they actually tried to get me to go with them, but at that point I was still too terrified of my parents just to try to sneak out. But Biggs, our buddy Steve, and their girlfriends at the time, they snuck out. They went driving around all night. And then, have you ever seen the original National Lampoon's Vacation?
Yes.
So the scene where they're all asleep in the car?
Yes.
And they just drive through a neighborhood while all asleep. Mm-hmm. It was basically that. So they were almost home. Biggs was on his way to drop Steve off. And then they just all conked out. And then he just kind of swipes 10 cars that are parked along the road, and then it's just it went as badly as a kind of sneaking out sojourn could possibly go. So anyway, just the thought of sneaking out, and I'm thinking of your mom saying I don't know if you've seen, there's this van. I'm just thinking of my dumbass friend Biggs cruising around in his big ass van.
Gosh, that's funny.
Yeah, God bless. Love you, Biggs. You're an idiot. But
I just hope you can drive.
Yeah, God bless. And so I guess then from that sort of rebellious phase, what was the kind of path that led you then to eventually becoming a teacher yourself?
So I went to Winthrop University in Rock Hill, South Carolina for my undergrad. And I really didn't know what I wanted to do. I really wasn't sure. I didn't really have any desire to go to college, but my family was, college or nothing. So I went and I just took all kinds of classes. I was, taking 18, 19 credit hours a semester just so that I could fill it with stuff that I thought would be cool. I mean, I was taking whitewater rafting and rock climbing, and I was taking abnormal psychology and, forensics, and just really anything that I could. Because somehow, miraculously, I was able to go to Winthrop on almost a full ride scholarship. And so I had the opportunity to really explore all of the classes that they offered. And the classes that I most enjoyed were those psychology courses, and specifically developmental psychology. So I, had a pretty rough go of things. Both my parents struggled with addiction, and there was a lot of, abuse and trauma in my household growing up. And that was really, really interesting, for lack of a better word. Just wanting to find out kind of how people's brains grow, and specifically how these things that happen to us when we're children, how do they affect your growing brain, and how do they move with us into adulthood? And so after switching my major no less than 4 times, I settled on developmental psychology. And so that's what I got my degree in. And I thought that I was going to go into pediatric therapy. And I was, planning on getting my master's in mental health counseling and working specifically with children who had encountered trauma. But after graduating with my bachelor's degree, I decided to get out of the South. I wanted to move to DC, which was, the biggest city that I could think of that was not too far away. And so I moved to DC, and I was trying desperately to find a job. Wasn't really sure, how was I going to work and go to grad school at the same time, just kind of trying to figure that stuff out. And I saw this opportunity that was kind of similar to, if you've heard of City Year or AmeriCorps. It was an opportunity like that, called the Capital Teaching Residency. And so you spent a year co-teaching in a classroom, and then you went to class at night every Wednesday. And by the end of the year, you were a certified licensed teacher in Washington, D.C. And maybe I just have really poor impulse control, but I said, that might be fun. And so I applied, and they offered me the position. They offered me to be a part of the cohort for 2017, 2018. And so I moved to DC, and I co-taught in a kindergarten classroom in Southeast DC from 2017 until, the end of the 2018 school year. And I loved it so much that I decided to stay. And so after that year, I did get my teaching license. I, filled out all the paperwork, took all the tests, and then decided I wanted to continue teaching. I just had so much fun, and it felt like something that was kind of a very impulsive last-ditch decision really ended up being exactly what I was supposed to be doing at that time, and still to this day.
So I don't know what month you were born, but I feel like our good friend Zoe from Season of the Bitch podcast would say that is very Sagittarius behavior.
So I'm not a Sagittarius. I am a Scorpio. But it is Sagittarius behavior. I will agree with that.
I know this because both Zoe and I are Sagittarius, and so she's often confirming for me that my impulsiveness and inability to follow through on stuff, links back to that. So shout out to Zoe.
That, or you just have undiagnosed ADHD, which was me until about 6 months ago.
That is also a very real possibility. Who can say?
Yeah,
there's really no way to know at this point. So I mean, it's wild how things like that happen, though, right? I mean, I know it's one of those tales as old as time, right? That so much of our lives and kind of the missions that we end up serving out through our lifetimes, and the loves we end up falling into, the relationships we end up having, the places we end up going. So much of it is kind of the result of just kind of happenstance, or you see a sign in a hallway and you're like, yeah, I got some time, I'll check out what's going on in this room, and then turns out that room was the kind of doorway to your future.
Mhm.
Never ceases to amaze me, honestly.
Yeah. I mean, it is truly just like such a happy accident. And so I taught in DC for 3 years. And then in the meantime, during that process, I ended up getting my master's in special education. And then last June, so this is what we then thought was the worst of the pandemic, I said, I'm going to blow up my life, as you do. And DC was still under very strict lockdown. I was staying home. I was teaching virtually. And I said, that would be a great time for me to move 7 hours down back to South Carolina. And so that's exactly what I did. So I've now been in Charleston for a year, and I guess that makes it a year and 2 months. And honestly, as wild as it's been, I've truly enjoyed every minute of it.
Well, let's talk about that, right? So, like I have a book actually coming out later this year where I interviewed kind of workers in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. Like you said, at a time where it felt like we were at the height of it.
Mm-hmm.
But now, you take South Carolina as an example, right? New COVID cases, as of today, I think are almost at, if not higher than where they were at the height in January of earlier this year.
Mm-hmm.
So we're very much, it's not fucking over, right? So anyway, the point being is that, I was always so fascinated asking folks to kind of narrate their own experience of what it was like living where you are, working where you work, when the reality of COVID-19 really kind of set in, when it was clear, what were you doing? What were you thinking first when this kind of madness that we've all been living through for over a year and a half, really started to set in? And then I guess we talk about how that has shaped your life and your work in the time since then.
Absolutely. So I was teaching first grade last March, and my school followed the DC and Maryland and Virginia protocols in shutting down for 2 weeks in March. And so when we were told on a Friday afternoon that, we would be saying goodbye to our students and that we would not see them again for 2 weeks. And so that's really kind of all I thought of it at that point in time. I mean, we weren't masking. We weren't really taking any precautions because we didn't have all of the information that we have now. And all we were told was, Friday, 3:00, you're going to say goodbye to your students. And by Monday, you need to have virtual learning rolled out. So teachers in the DC area were given a grand total of 2 days. Friday afternoon, we were told that by Monday, we would need to have our whole lives, our whole curriculum, the rest of the year ready to go on some sort of virtual learning platform, which right out the gate, very interesting that we would be told we needed to have the entire rest of the year's worth of planning online when we were only going to be virtual for 2 weeks. But that's what we were told. So I took the materials that I could take. I took them to my teeny tiny apartment and spent, the next 2 days trying to figure out how I was going to teach 7-year-olds virtually. And, I really did think it was just going to be 2 weeks. And then it was 2 more weeks, and then 2 more weeks. And then after about 2 months, they finally said, I don't think we're going to go back for the rest of the school year. I think we're going to be done. So that was, I mean, it was a blow. I went back to my classroom at the end of the year and it was memorialized. You know, it looked just like it did when we left that day in March. The bulletin boards were still up. I still had student work up from that March. So it was all very bizarre. And we were at that point at the pandemic where nobody really knew anything. And so I was assuming the best. We were all doing the best we could. We were trying to make it work with the little information that we did have. So.
Yeah. I mean, I was like, I don't know, like jumping into a vat of hand sanitizer, like before leaving the house or coming back. Right. I mean, yeah. No one knew. I don't know. It was like how it's transmitted. Is it droplets? Does it come in on your feet? Are you dragging it in the house? Like I know that like during COVID-19, I know for me at least, but I think I've talked to enough people who feel the same way that it seems like kind of a generalized effect of going through this. But like my sense of time is all fucked up.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Like, I mean, time has just become a flat circle for me. Like, you know, there's no past, there's no future. There's just like an eternally like low grade, horrifying, boring present. Where it's like it's boring in the sense that you've just become used to that fear and adjusted to it as a standard part of your life. So you actually don't live in fear, but you live like by fear, right? You know, like in a lot of ways.
Well, it's so funny because even just as I was explaining that to you, I was having to remind myself that we've now had 2 end of the school years during COVID-19. So that was obviously the very first end of the school year when COVID was just kind of getting the nation's attention. But we've also had a whole full school year since that's even happened. And I mean, my sense of time, especially in relation to my work, has just been completely warped.
Well, what was last year like, if I can ask? Were you still teaching at the level that you were the previous year, or is that when you started doing math intervention?
So I was still teaching elementary school. I was teaching 3rd grade, and I was teaching in Charleston. And so I had moved to Charleston that June, and then we began the year in August. However, we began the year virtually. We were not really privy to if or when we were going to go back in person. But in October, actually, we began full 5-day, every student in the classroom all the time. And that is where things really started to get kind of sticky. We were told that anytime a student would test positive, that obviously they would be sent home to quarantine. And then all of the students that were in close contact with that student would also be quarantined. We were all supposed to be wearing masks. We were all supposed to be social distancing. However, none of those things actually happened. So we would have a student whose parent would reach out and say that they had tested positive and they were going to be quarantining. However, they wouldn't report it. There was a lot of shady shit happening in terms of, schools misreporting the numbers of COVID cases that they have. And so the elementary school that I was teaching at that time was one of them, where I would have like my personal class, I would have 2 students whose parents had said that they were confirmed to have tested positive and that they would not be at school. However, if you had looked at the Charleston County COVID-19 dashboard, those 2 cases were not being documented as related to the school. So that alone was red flag number 1. And then, you have class sizes that are the same exact size as they were the year or, 2 years prior. And if you've ever been in a room with 25 7-year-olds, you know that there's absolutely no way that you can keep them from touching each other and keep them, and have force them to keep their masks over their mouth and nose. And so we would have a student who would test positive, and then the nurse and the vice principal and the principal would come in to do the close contact interviews. And I would say, well, this student who tested positive has a really hard time keeping their mask over their mouth and nose, and they've walked around the classroom several times. So it would be in the best interest for our entire class to quarantine. And of course, that wouldn't happen. Maybe the two students who sat on either side would be quarantined. But even myself, as the teacher, since we were considered essential, as long as we were asymptomatic, we were required to still be at work. And then, being in a 700 square foot classroom with 22, 23 children, there's physically no way for you to keep kids 6 feet apart from each other. There's just not enough space. And so that became a real issue, because we were required to keep students 6 feet away from each other, but then we would have the entire third grade and they would go out to the playground at the same time. And so there was a lot of misinformation, and there was a lot of hypocrisy in that. Okay, so when I'm teaching, my students need to be 6 feet away, but we can have 150 third graders come out and all be playing at the playground at the same time. So things like that just kept happening. And several times we would have entire classrooms or even entire grade levels that would end up having to quarantine because so many children were getting sick. And yet the school as a whole stayed open for the whole rest of the year. And it was after that I had to leave, because it was just so damaging. It became really clear that the administrators and the people who were making these decisions genuinely did not care about these kids and their families.
I mean, this is going to be one of those things that I think we all really need to sit down and think through and really kind of act on if and when this nightmare is ever truly over, right? Mm-hmm. Because, we were just talking about the kind of the weird flattening of time over the past 1.5 to 2 years, right? And so much of what we've gone through and experienced at work and at home just all merges into this gray mush of our memory, where we maybe have vague recollections of this or that interaction or this or that moment, but it's very hard to place on a kind of linear timeline. And the reason I bring that back up, right, is because when people look back at the national map and the state maps, and the graphs that showed the different quote unquote COVID waves, the different spikes in new cases, in deaths, and so on and so forth, right? It's going to be hard to remember where those lines came from, right? How those spikes happen, the decisions that were made or not made that really contributed to them. And that's I guess what I'm really trying to get at here, right? Because I want to ask at the end of this kind of diatribe, what it was like and what it's been like for South Carolina, both in terms of the general public, but also the mayor, superintendent, right? Like you said, the folks making these decisions. But I guess by way of getting there, the point that I really want to stress for folks listening, right, is this is something that you and I were talking about before we even got to the recording, right? How bonkers it is that the kind of ways that cities and school districts and states have all handled this has it's just been a kind of free for all, right? It's kind of what I would call a grotesque laboratory politics where, the federal government was often kicking things down to the states were kicking things down to counties. And it was kind of just everyone was do what you want. We'll see if anything works. Right. And in that mentality, right? For almost 2 years now, so many governors, superintendents, mayors, and all these folks have basically been able to play like Russian roulette with people's lives. Whether it was frickin' Lori Lightfoot going after teachers in Chicago who were saying it's not safe to reopen this time last year, and she was using it as an occasion to kind of try to turn the public against the unions, and Lori Lightfoot is a piece of shit. But that's a story for another day. But it's very representative, right, of this larger sort of trend, right? Like, I mean, shit, whether you're talking about Lori in Chicago, whether you're talking about what's his name? Greg Abbott in Texas, whether you're talking about, just the madness that's happening all throughout Florida and all across these different states, right? These powerful people and institutions have just been kind of making decisions like flying by the seat of their pants. And if those decisions go completely south, if they lead to like massive spikes in COVID cases and deaths, what repercussions have they faced for that, right? Because I feel as if like for most of these people, they, in a grim sort of way, saw all of this as an opportunity to be like the one mayor who got it right? The person who stood up to unions and reopened schools safely. Right, or the person who bucked the kind of like anti-freedom mask-wearing mandates and showed that it worked. Right, there's so many examples over the past 2 years of how those decisions were wrong, they failed, and they led to people getting sick and dying. But that was always why it was okay for them to take that gamble, because if they missed, if they screwed up with their decisions, they were kind of in no worse of a position than anyone else around the country, right? They could just say, oh, well, we're still learning about COVID, right? So everyone gets a free pass for taking these liberties with our children, with our grandparents, with us, with working people's lives. And, it's just like, yeah, I don't know. Does that make sense? Because I find myself almost so angry about it to even speak coherently about it. But I guess, like, why don't we focus this and talk about South Carolina itself? So, like, what sorts of decisions have been made by people in power, and what sorts of, I guess, culture has existed that you've witnessed in South Carolina as far as handling the pandemic over these past 2 years?
Sure. So I'll start by saying that only 46% of South Carolinians are fully vaccinated. So right out the gate, vaccine rollout in South Carolina has not been very successful. Obviously, there are higher percentages of vaccinations in areas like Myrtle Beach, in Charleston, in Greenville, in sections of South Carolina that are more heavily populated, that have a younger population and a less rural population. McMaster, who is the governor of South Carolina and who is an absolute monster, has said right out the gate that schools are not allowed, not permitted to enforce any sort of mask mandate. And even went one step further to say that school districts who did enforce a mask mandate would then lose state funding. So literally he's saying, if you are going to force children to wear a mask and force adults to wear a mask, then you are going to lose $42 that you're getting from the state of South Carolina. Now, private schools and, charter schools, that doesn't really affect them as much. They have parents that are paying tuition, and so they can say, we're going to force a mask mandate anyways, because we don't really need state funding. However, for the public schools, specifically public schools like the ones that I work at, they are in neighborhoods, in areas where families are really relying on state support, and the school is really relying on state support. And so there's zero loopholes. There's no way for schools to get around not enforcing masks. And so while masks are strongly encouraged, they are not enforced. And as teachers in the building, we are not permitted to do anything other than remind a student that they should probably be wearing their mask over their nose and mouth. So you have quite a few students who are not wearing a mask at all. You have students who are wearing their mask like a chin strap. You have students who are wearing a mask with it hanging off of one ear. I mean, it is truly, I would say, significantly worse than it was this time last year. And, the data that's coming specifically out of Charleston County says the same thing, that the total reported positive cases in Charleston County are the highest they have been this past week since the beginning of the pandemic. So Charleston has a higher number of positive cases now than it ever has before. And yet what I'm noticing just on like a cultural level is that fear is gone. That fear is gone completely. Nobody is, hand sanitizing repeatedly. In fact, the hand sanitizer stations have been taken out. The water fountains are turned back on. All of the precautions that went into last school year when schools were trying to safely reopen have now been taken away. And it really does just kind of feel like a free-for-all. I mean, they've taken the social distancing guidelines and shortened it from 6 feet to 3 feet. So that means now you can have even more students in a classroom. But then you see more data coming out of South Carolina that's showing that kids and adults are getting sick. I mean, we had 3 teachers in Dorchester County, which is the county next to Charleston. 3 teachers died last week because they were teaching. 3 teachers got sick and died. And then
Jesus,
you have 2,000 students and staff in Beaufort County, which is by Hilton Head Island, 2,000 students and staff in quarantine after an uptick in COVID cases there. So it's not just a little bit worse, it's significantly worse. I mean, since March of 2020, you're looking at almost 600,000 people just in South Carolina who are sick and something like 10,000 people who are dying. Our hospitalizations are going up, our quarantines are going up, and now they're lacking the infrastructure to support students who are quarantining. Last school year, we had all kinds of precautions in place. We had, plexiglass dividers, which not super effective, but better than nothing. Kids were required to wear masks. Adults were required to wear masks. If a student did have to quarantine, we had the virtual learning tools so that student didn't have to really miss school, obviously, unless they were really sick. Now we have none of that. On Monday, this is a great example. On Monday, my class of 25 students had 9 students in it because all of the rest of them were either sick or quarantining. Now, all of that to say that I, myself, as the teacher, am not allowed to quarantine unless I'm showing symptoms. So even though over half of my class is out because they're either sick or have been deemed close contact, as long as I am asymptomatic, I'm required to report to work, which is terrifying. My partner is immunosuppressed. My family, which I shouldn't have to legitimize my concern by saying that the people around me are in danger. It should just be a very natural concern that I don't want to get sick and I don't want the people around me to get sick. I am double vaccinated. I am wearing a mask. I am advocating for my students, because they are old enough to be vaccinated, to go get vaccinated. And the fact that that's being demonized and politicized is insane to me. We're looking around, South Carolina, Charleston specifically, we're seeing huge upticks in numbers, higher than they were this time last year, because all of the, safety net precautions have been taken away. And the mentality from these decision makers is, well, if you get it, you get it. You better hope you don't go to the hospital because they're full. So good luck, peace and blessings. And it's absolutely terrifying.
My God, man, I don't even know what to say to that, right? I mean, it's like you said, it feels like this kind of bizarro world where the cases are up, if not higher than they've ever been. Mm-hmm. And yet, like, we are acting with like less caution than we ever have at any moment in this pandemic. And I'm just really trying to kind of understand that, right? Because obviously, you know, when I talk to conservative folks, when I listen to right-wing radio and whatnot, right, there's this big kind of the constant talking point of like, you know, this is just part of the risk of living, right? You know, you risk getting the flu when you get into an elevator with people. You're going to risk getting COVID. You know, we can't stop the whole world from turning yada, 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 right? As a someone who grew up conservative, right, I understand where that mindset comes from and try to kind of, you know, argue against it as best I can. But it really does feel like, you know, in most cases, a sort of like iron wall has been put up around people's heads. Like they don't want to hear that. They don't want to hear counter arguments to the contrary. The numbers are not going to really convince them that we should go back to kind of taking the precautions that we were before, and that we're just kind of in this sort of horrifyingly nihilistic way, just like swan diving into the abyss and seeing who comes out the other side. Like it feels like that is our new like kind of program for handling this.
Right. I find myself, you know, looking at the numbers, and I mean, I have the Charleston County school dashboard bookmarked on my computer because I am checking it. I mean, just at one of the schools I work at, just at one of them, in the 8 days of school that we have had, we had 30 positive cases. So 30 students who tested positive at school, because if they test positive outside of school, they don't have to report it, right? That's another thing, is if you test positive for COVID at school, then the nurse is reporting it to DHEC. It is going to the dashboard. But if you're testing positive at the CVS down the road, then, you know, you don't have to tell your school. You can just not show up for 10 days and then come back. And that's the scariest part, is that I have students now who I don't know necessarily if they have or have had COVID. They just haven't been to school in 8 days. And, you know, then they're showing up and they're not wearing a mask, or maybe they're showing up and then telling me after the fact, oh, sorry, I had COVID. But then I find myself looking around and I'm almost in this state of, is everyone else seeing what I'm seeing? Like I almost feel like I'm being gaslit, because I'm looking around going, am I insane? Because I'm the only one that seems to be stressed about this. Like, does nobody else see what I'm seeing?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, and given the position that you and your coworkers are being put in, how can you not feel that way, right? Because, like, you know, again, it's not just like the district that you're fighting with, right? You're fighting against this kind of like massive cultural machine that includes churches, that includes radio and cable, right? That has really convinced a lot of parents, that has convinced a lot of community members that you, as an educator, and your fellow educators need to basically just shut up, deal with it, and go back in. It's not that bad kind of thing, right? And I don't even know how you do, like you process that. And I guess, you know, like it absolutely breaks my heart to hear this, and I just like am looking around, like, you know, like what are we actually going to do? But I think you raise a really, I think, important question that I've been thinking about a lot, especially after, like I said, doing that book where I was interviewing other workers about their experience with COVID. We've been talking to workers on this show throughout the entire pandemic. Mm-hmm. It feels like we took, you know, the route that America knows how to take best, right? because so much of what we talk about on this show, right, are the gross injustices and inequalities and inhumanities, right, that working people experience on a day-to-day basis, right? We don't just focus on the bad stuff, right? We try to really celebrate people's lives and their stories and the great achievements that they have at work, the skills that they develop, but also the elephant in the room, right, is that, like, America is not a workers' utopia, right? There's a lot of terrible things that workers here have to endure that they shouldn't have to endure, but we do endure because it has just been beaten into us from birth that this is the best that we can expect, right? And that we would actually be wrong and out of place or disrespectful or ungrateful to demand more than that, right? Whether that is like a federal minimum wage that is a third of what it should be if it kept up with inflation, like from 50 years ago, right? Whether it is at will employment, the fact that so many millions of workers can just be fired for whatever reason or for no reason at all, right, in this country. We've just accepted that as kind of like, well, I don't have any power to change it. This is part of what it means to be a working person in this country. And so then we just, like everything else, we just accept kind of the brutal reality with which we're presented and told that we have no power to kind of change, right? Like, it feels like, sadly, we have slipped into accepting that same type. We've slipped into that same type of acceptance when it comes to kind of the people who are going to get sick and die, or have lasting sort of impacts from COVID-19, yada, yada, yada. It's just one of those things where we're just like, well, this is throw it onto the pile, right? This is what, living and working in the United States is now, and get over it.
Gosh, that is so true. We are told again and again and again that this is what we have signed up for, right? And that if we want to, and that if we want to play a valuable role in this society, that we just have to shut up and do what we're told to do. And, I know this is true for teachers. I know this is true for so many other professions, particularly service professions, where the expectation is that you are giving your whole self every single day, and that you're giving so much of yourself that you're leaving nothing left, that you're leaving at the end of the day and you are just empty. I can't imagine what would happen to schools as a whole if teachers only gave between their contract hours, right? And that if teachers actually stepped up and said, I am not going to continue to do something that is going to endanger myself and my family and people I love. And on top of that, like, I am only going to fulfill what is contracted of me, right? You'd end up with no school supplies. You'd end up with no lessons planned. You would end up with, your worst worksheet teacher that you can think of. And that's not just for teachers. That's for, like I said, all service professions, because again, the expectation is that you're running yourself dry and you're shutting up because this is what you signed up for. And for so many of us, it is, I guess, what we did sign up for, but not really. I didn't become a teacher because I wanted to spend my life savings on school supplies for students. I became a teacher because I genuinely wanted to support students who struggled with school like I did. And yet I am being told in a matter of, 10 months, we've gone from, oh my gosh, you guys are heroes. This is the hardest job in the world. I don't know how you do it, to shut up and open schools because we have to go back to work, So we've gone from this profession that is so highly regarded as the pillar of all other professions to, you're a babysitter. And I feel like that's true for so many other professions. We are simply being treated like it's our responsibility to keep the world turning so that the people who have and the people who make decisions for the rest of us can go about their normal lives.
Yeah. And and I think this is, brilliantly and heartbreakingly put, right? Is like, in so many ways, educators across the board, like, this is something the brilliant educator and organizer Rebecca Gorelli once told me. Is just like, like the economy doesn't run without us, right? Because like you said, it is like the most essential form of quote unquote childcare that the rest of the working public has in order to do the jobs that they do, to pay for their life and to keep the gears of society turning. Like, if you don't have that, as everything kind of breaks down, right? And it's just like, the other thing that comes to mind, you mentioned something about this earlier, and I didn't want to let it kind of pass. But I think, like, when you're talking about the people who make those decisions, just being able to kind of, carry on with their lives and kind of basically do what we're seeing now, which is like blame individuals for screwing everything up, right? And I think that is really, sadly, the point that we are at as a country as we enter into a new school year, as we're already seeing stories of school districts that had to open in August are already closing down, or like you said, whole classrooms are quarantining, right? What is happening is kind of what a lot of folks said would happen, especially folks on the front lines like yourself said was going to happen. And people, who don't want to wrestle with that or do anything about it are falling back on this kind of really get out of jail free card of saying like, oh, well, it's because people aren't, taking responsibility and social distancing or what have you. And it's just like, that is not an answer. That is not an acceptable excuse. And something like schools shows exactly why, right? Because like you said, these students, they've been at home for the past school year. This has been incredibly rough for all of us. I can't imagine what it's like to be a developing child / young adult kind of going through all of this, yada, yada, yada. Like, obviously there's no great option here, but at the same time, when folks reopen schools with lax kind of enforcement of this or that mandate and not following kind of strict protocols. And then, like you said, like hundreds of kids are just kind of congregating around each other at recess. Then they kind of like want to turn around and blame the kids or blame like, the guidance counselor who was supposed to be out there watching. It's just like, that's what kids do. Like, if your plan for, mitigating the spread of COVID-19 is to just get kids to not act like kids or not get human beings to act like human beings, then that's not a goddamn plan, right? It's wishful thinking. And yet somehow we have managed to let so many people in positions of power just follow this line of thinking, and we go along with it.
Right. I think something that I keep hearing over and over from, both the governor of South Carolina and from a lot of similar thinkers is they're disguising the reopening of schools by saying that students have really struggled this past year and that, kids need to be in schools so that they can learn, right? That seems to be the number one argument, is that, when students are not in school, they're not logging in, they don't have internet at home, so they need to be physically in the school building so that they can learn. But what I think they're glossing over when making these kind of claims is that students have to be alive to learn. And I know that that's like a crazy thing to say, but when we prioritize student learning over student life, what we see is that students are not learning, period, because they're in and out of schools every other day anyways, because parents aren't sure, parents are afraid, they don't want to send their kids in when they're seeing these numbers rise, when their teacher is sick, when we go from this 0 to 100 all or nothing mentality. What we end up with is, at the end of the day, we're putting children's lives in danger, and we're expecting them to make smarter decisions than the people who are making decisions for the state of South Carolina. Henry McMaster is putting the responsibility on 6 and 7-year-olds. And that's insane to me. And then saying, well, students have to learn. Yes, they do. but they have to be alive to learn. And they have to be, they can't be mourning a family member because they brought COVID home. They have to be safe first before we can even worry about the learning that's happening.
Well, let's talk about that, right? Because I could genuinely talk to you about this for days, but I know that, you have school coming up this week. Given everything that you and your colleagues are enduring, it's, I don't want to take up more of your time than I absolutely have to. And I genuinely appreciate you taking the time to talk with me about all of this. And like I said, I'm heartbroken. I'm infuriated. And, I guess I just don't want it to be lost on people that it didn't have to go this way, right? There were so many ways that we could have done better, and we shouldn't fall into that trap of listening to powerful people tell us that this was the only outcome that there was ever going to be, and thus let them off the hook. I hope that that's one of the big kind of takeaways here, right? If we had listened to teachers, if we had listened to healthcare workers more, if we had genuinely tried to protect working people on the front lines, if we had genuinely tried harder to kind of sustain people to stay at home and be able to pay their bills and pay for food, we could have done this differently. To say nothing of making sure that the vaccine got to as many people around the world as possible, so that we wouldn't get the rise of all these new variants, instead of just protecting the intellectual property and profits of pharmaceutical companies, yada, 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 right? Point is, we fucked this up. Right. We pardon my language, but we screwed this up a million ways from Sunday. And now we're living with the kind of fallout, and we're just kind of accepting it as kind of the natural way of things. But we shouldn't, because, we just shouldn't. Right. We need to learn from our mistakes. We need to make sure we don't do this crap again. And we need to do what we can to protect people right now, which is not what is happening. Right. And so I wanted to, I guess, kind of like talk about that aspect, because, it's kind of wild that, we've been talking for over an hour now, and we actually haven't talked that much about, like, what does the job of teaching your students look like right now, right? Because like you said, you can't even really get to that point when you're stuck dealing with all these other, like, safety measures and students not showing up and all the kind of loopholes that people are falling through with how the district is approaching its COVID policy. So I guess I wanted to ask, like, feels dumb to ask this now after everything we've been talking about, but, like, how are you actually teaching at this point?
Right. So let me start by saying that, like, the people who are making these decisions for schools, for classrooms, for healthcare workers are predominantly people who have never stepped foot inside a classroom and who have never stepped foot inside the ICU, or a COVID wing. Like, the people who are making decisions that are directly affecting working people are not working people. And I think that's worth mentioning again, is that the people who are making decisions for us have absolutely no idea what it actually looks like. And so now, as a high school math interventionist, basically a high school math teacher, realistically, the majority of my work is online, which I know is crazy to say because I have students in person. However, I have to keep my students apart from each other. And so, think about your high school experience about, doing projects and doing group work and, getting up and talking to your friends and having the opportunity for discussion and collaboration. And all of that is gone because we have to keep kids safe. And so what's craziest, I think, is that if we were to go virtual, the actual work that my students are doing would be very similar, because they're doing the majority of their work on a Chromebook. So, there's not that much of a difference, because most classrooms, especially upper level classrooms, are paperless. Students aren't typing, or students aren't like handwriting and turning in essays anymore. They're not doing worksheets anymore. Pretty much everything is done virtually. It makes teachers' lives easier. It makes organization easier. It makes grading easier. But that's why I think for me, I'm so flabbergasted when people say that students can't be doing this at home, because I'm not sure, what I'm not sure what school they're talking about, because the schools I'm working at and, the teacher friends that I have, pretty much everyone is working paperlessly. And so the work can be transferred between school and home. My day-to-day right now looks like students walking into the classroom space. Class desks are in what I like to call EOG rows, which stands for end of grade rows. If you remember taking your end of grade tests at the end of the year, you would have, your single desks, and they would be in straight rows so that nobody was touching anybody else. And that's what it has to be now, because we have to keep students away from each other so they can't sit together anymore. We are not sharing materials. So, anything that would require hands-on manipulatives, students are either not using those manipulatives, or they're using them virtually, or they have their own set that they're responsible for and responsible for cleaning, because we can't share them. Students are staggered in transitions in the hallway because they're not supposed to be congregating in the hallways. We don't use lockers anymore. Students are keeping everything in their backpack, keeping it with them at all times. And, I think most importantly, the biggest difference we're seeing is that the attendance policy is kind of all over the place. So prior to these past few years, anything more than 10 absences in a school year, and you would be considered retained, because at that point, after 10 absences, that's so much makeup work that there would be a conversation about retention. And now the attendance policy is lax. And so as students get older, you'll have students who you see once a week, and the expectation on my end is still that those students are learning and doing the same work and completing the same level of work as their peers, even though they're not being held accountable for actually coming to school. So teachers are being asked and being held responsible for being in school and student learning. But on a school-wide or a county-wide level, there is nothing that's supporting teachers in that effort. And so you'll have students who just aren't coming to school for, personal reasons, or maybe their parents aren't comfortable sending them to school, but there's no support from administration or from, the school level, the county level, to make sure that those kids are learning too.
Jeez. It's like, you definitely don't have to answer this, but where do you think this is going to go? Are we just expecting that, by the end of September, a bunch of these schools are going to shut down? I don't know where,
yes, I think so. It's up to administrators. Principals have the authority to close their own schools if they don't feel it's safe. And so I think that's what we're going to start seeing, and especially in Charleston, we're going to start seeing schools who, are going to flip McMaster the bird and close schools anyways. And then it's going to be exactly like it was 2 years ago, where overnight teachers and staff are going to be expected to transform everything to a virtual learning space. I think we're more prepared to do that now than we were 2 years ago. But I still think, if we had planned better in the first place, then we wouldn't even be here.
I think that's, like I said before, heartbreakingly, but perfectly put. And, I guess by way of rounding us out, I just kind of wanted to ask, how you're doing with all of this, and I guess any final takeaway thoughts for listeners about, how they can show support for educators like yourself around the country.
For myself and for a lot of educators around the country, we are going to continue this work because it is what we have been called to do. Every single school, that I know of, both in South Carolina and around the country, are dealing with significant shortages in teachers and staff. There were more teachers that left the profession this past school year than the last 10, 15 years. So teachers are leaving in droves because of the way that they're being expected to carry on without support. And so I think with that being said, just an understanding or even a willingness to understand the burden is so vital. You know, thinking of what exactly is happening inside of a classroom today and being willing to reach out to educators and ask for what they need. I mean, donations of PPE, like schools are no longer providing PPE for students or for teachers. You know, school supplies, because now we're being asked for every student to have their own school supplies. So for high schoolers, I'm buying, 80 sets of everything because my students have to have their own stuff. So, if you know a teacher and you want to throw them a couple dollars on Venmo so they can buy face masks and colored pencils for all of their students, I know they'll appreciate it. But more than anything else, just compassion and just understanding that we are not babysitters and that we are coming from a place of love and compassion. And like, if teachers stayed in the profession this year, they did it because they genuinely care about students and genuinely want students and families to learn and to be successful. And so I think keeping that in mind as you go about your interactions, as you are engaging with schools and teachers and communities, is more helpful than anything else.
So I try not to think about what I left in Virginia. When I call my kin, they tell me again, you're the happiest you've ever been. So I try not to think of the whiskey once it gets in ya. Well, I reminisce and I start to miss the way you looked at me back then. So I know, and I know, it treats you like a queen. So come down to Charleston, I'll be your Carolina king. 'Cause I miss my boy, I hope that he had a good Christmas. But it's late July and a little late to try to be present with no gifts. So I know, and I know, it treats you like a queen. So come down to Charleston, I'll be your Carolina king. Come down to Charleston, I'll be your Carolina king. Last time I called, your mama said, boy, don't you call here. 'Cause you did her wrong and she's done moved on. Then you went and wrote some sad country songs. And you know, Well, I sure as hell know it treats you like a queen. So come down to Charleston, and I'll be your Carolina king. So I know, and I know, it treats you like a queen. So come down to Charleston, I'll be your Carolina king.